So, good evening. Again, my name is Allegra Cooper, and I am excited and honored to be here today at this DevOps Lisbon meetup. So, thank you again for having me. My presentation today will be on contract testing, how to deploy microservices with confidence using Pact and Swagger. So, to tell you a little bit about myself, I am a tech lead at Vanguard. I've been there for 9 years and I've worked on many different divisions, many different teams and projects. So, I've had a lot of experience with different problems that teams could have experienced while doing that transition into microservices. And in my free time, I love movies and I love to travel. To give you some background about Vanguard, Vanguard was founded in 1975, and they are a financial service industry. They have 8.1 trillion in global assets. Most people may know Vanguard because you may have your investments, 401ks in Vanguard. You may have some personal investments in Vanguard. So Vanguard is split between the business side and the IT side. I work on the IT side, not the business side. So I usually cannot give you any financial advice about your investments. But our IT side is made up of lots of subdivisions, and it could be over 300 IT teams, and they support different business lines. So back in 2018, there was about 170 teams doing continuous delivery, and they were probably deploying about twice a month. And we calculated that it maybe have been about 2,400 deployments that in a year. So we have been deploying way more than that since then. I'm sure even the number of teams have grown since then. I can speak personally about the team that I'm on. We can deploy and have deployed almost every week. So we've gotten to that point where we used to deploy as a company years ago before we did continuous delivery 4 times a year, 5 times a year. And then we finally have gotten to certain teams, depending on their architecture, they can deploy whenever they want. I'll also say too, I forgot to mention, I'm okay with you asking questions throughout the presentation. I might even stop throughout the presentation and ask if anyone has questions. But like they said, that someone will be looking to see if anyone's raising their hands or posting any questions. So feel free to definitely ask. And at the end, there's going to be a short true and false questions just to see how much you've retained. So let's just jump into what is a contract. Well, before I even get into what a contract is, let's go back to the monolith, right? Many teams, or maybe some teams out here, are still working in the monolith. So at that time, everyone coded together, tested together, built together, and deployed together. So people thought that was great until one day a team came and said, hey, I'm working on a new feature, and I don't think that what I'm building has anything to do with these other teams or these other applications. So I should be able to code independently, test my changes independently, build it independently from everyone else, and also deploy it independently. So that's exactly what happens. And that brings us to the microservice world, where we have consumers and providers. Consumers send requests to providers, and providers send back a response. And now each individual service can deploy whenever they want. So you can imagine that people definitely enjoyed this better than the monolith, but it could lead to some unexpected issues in production if a consumer or a provider introduce breaking changes without the other person knowing. So then we get into, again, what is a contract, right? So a contract is a written agreement between two parties. Therefore, if both parties have a contract, then the contract testing can identify any issues or breaches in this contract before the consumer or the provider goes to production. Okay. So when we rolled out microservices, we ran into these two problems. First, the provider could introduce an API change which breaks the consumer in production, or the consumer could introduce a change which misinterprets the data from the provider's API in production. So let's take a look at both of those. So our objective was to identify any breaches in this contract before either the consumer or the provider side goes to production. And our solution to that was to introduce contract testing across all of these teams, across all of our divisions, that they should all implement contract testing between all consumers and provider microservices. And in order to do that, we introduced a framework called Pact. So whenever a consumer is coupled to the interface of a service to make use of its behavior, a contract is formed between them. Pact is a framework that supports consumer-driven contract testing. Now, you're going to hear me say that a lot throughout the presentation. Pact supports consumer-driven, meaning the consumer has to write the contract or the Pact file. So let's look at the concepts and the pieces that's needed for Pact. So you have the consumer side, which makes the request to a service. Then you have the provider side, which responds to that request. Then you have the Pact file, which is your contract. It is a JSON file that's containing the request a consumer is making and those expected responses from the provider. And then we have the Pact Broker, which is just a centralized location for storing all of our Pact files. Our broker is hosted on AWS Cloud. Here's an example of a Pact file. So these are important pieces. So a provider, the provider's name, the consumer's name, the interactions. So this is the important parts too, is the description. You need a very clear description on what this test case is for. The request that's being made. So in this case, it's a GET request, and they're making the request to the path of the client account information with a query param of 1234. That's the ID. And then they're expecting this response from the provider. The status of 200 with a body of account type, name, and account balance. So Pact has many features, and it allows for you to write contracts that are either very, very specific or very, very general. So very general is saying, I'm just expecting these fields, and they could be of any type. So these are strings. An account balance could have been just a type of big decimal or an integer, or it could be specific. I am only allowing this field to only have these specific values. If it has anything other than these values, then the test should fail. So to break it down in about the implementation of Pact. Step 1, define the consumer expected outcomes. The consumer creates the Pact, and then the Pact is uploaded to the broker. So this Pact is recording on the request and the expected response. And then on part 2, the provider side. The provider has to verify the consumer's expectations. So they write a Pact verification test to verify that Pact file. And then this is an example of Pact Broker. So like I said, Pact allows for a lot of different features. So the broker is going to hold a Pact file. So you can see this is going to be the name of the consumer and the provider that was in the Pact file. It allows you to be able to click this file icon so you can see the Pact file, and this would be the latest file. It has the matrix feature, which I'll talk about more later, but the matrix keeps track of every Pact file that's uploaded and so all the versions of that file, as well as every time that file was verified. So here over on the side, you can see here, this file was uploaded, and the green is showing that this file was verified by the provider and it passed. Blank, of course, means that it was not verified. Yellow means that the file was uploaded, verified by the provider, and a new file, the consumer uploaded a new file that has changes to the broker, and that new version has not been verified yet. And then red shows that the file was uploaded, the provider verified it, but the verification failed. So every time this happens, that matrix feature is keeping track. And then this create here is for webhooks, which I'll also talk about later. So to go through the Pact Broker build process. So this is how Vanguard as a company implemented Pact and Pact Broker for the consumer and the provider into our build process, so that everything can be easily automated. So the consumer writes the test gets executed during the consumer build, creates the Pact file, publishes to the broker. If the build is successful, it then publishes the Pact file to the broker. Then they reach out to the provider side, notify the provider that a new Pact file is on the broker. The provider will write the provider test cases and check those into the build. And then the verification process will happen. So during the verification this is on the provider build, then the build process will go to the Pact broker, get that Pact file, and check whether or not the test that the provider wrote matches the Pact file that's on the broker. So if they don't match, the build will fail. The contract, then they should contact the consumer. The consumer then modifies the expectations and creates a new Pact file or works with the provider to update the service. If it passes, they match, verification pass, then the build is successful. And then those results, those provider verification results, are then published back to the broker, as we saw on the last slide. Okay.
Allegra,
so
sorry to interrupt. You have a question from Rob. Rob, would you like to make the question live?
Sure. Does Vanguard build or maintain the Pact framework?
Yes, it's all in-house. I was on that team that built out this implementation, test everything out, and also created trainings for teams. Yeah, and the broker too is all hosted in-house. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Sure. Is there any other questions?
Well, I don't know if it's the right moment to ask this question, but in terms to implement and maintain this in-house, what is the effort and trouble that we can expect?
Which part? Are you just asking about the maintenance now, and now that everything's been rolled out?
Actually both, because eventually if you would like to use it in-house with the current implementation of Pact Broker, I think there's orchestration that needs to be developed and eventually for maintenance. So what do you think this costs, and if it actually is worth going this round or for try looking for other solutions like hosted solutions?
So I did think it was worth it. It was not that much difficulty or time or cost to set up the broker. Like I said, it's hosted on the cloud. I think I built it on EC2. Doesn't take too much time or effort or cost. It's still up to date, and a lot of teams are still benefiting from it. I think we honestly didn't really roll it out until we had the broker in place, because we needed a centralized location to hold these Pact files. And then when we get to the provider side and we have the verification and the build to run against the Pact file, it just makes things a lot easier. Teams don't want to do anything manual. So I definitely think it's worth it if you're going with Pact to have the broker. And the maintenance afterwards, and we didn't do any separation by divisions. We have one broker for all of IT. And the maintenance, I would say, for the broker is not a lot. I don't see, Pact changing their broker. Maybe they roll out some new updates. Maybe you need to update a version of something that's needed to rebuild it, something like that. But as far as I know, not too much of an update or maintenance. I think once it got built out, maybe it took a couple of months to do phase one. So everything I'm talking about right now is pretty much phase one. Yes, until I get to the problem. So we had all of this built out for teams to POC and try it probably in a couple of months. Yeah,
Thank you.
so yes, you're welcome. But yeah, if you're going to do a different framework than Pact, then think about still the same pieces of the concept, right? Where are you going to hold the Pact files? You still need a centralized location. I think that is very important.
Have you seen team communication improve now that they have Pact files that kind of dictate their communication?
Oh yes, definitely. That is definitely one of the key points in using Pact that I'll definitely mention later. But that is the key too. In any tool that you choose, if you do decide to go with a different tool, the driver is the communication. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna keep going. So on the consumer side, you can have a web app and a web service. So for example, this was taken from the training that we put together. So we had a web app for search consumer, client search consumer, and then client account info, consumer web service. And then we had the provider web service. So we had teams that wanted to write packs through web app and web services and communicate with our provider web services. So in this example, the first consumer, they're creating a contract with a GET request with the responses of the name, address, email, and age, and date of birth. And they're going to send that to the Pact Broker. The second consumer, now they're writing a contract, and in their same contract, they have a GET request and a POST request. So their GET request with the client ID, they're expecting the response of the name, account type, account balance. And their POST is the client ID, name, account balance, account type, and they're expecting a response of a 200. They're going to upload that Pact file to the broker. And then once it gets on the broker, the provider will then write their Pact verification test against these two files. So what are the current gaps? Can anybody think of anything that could go wrong with this current situation? Feel free to jump in.
As a consumer, I can't create the Pact file until the provider service already exists. As a provider, I can't verify that my service behaves as expected until the consumer creates a Pact file. So there's a whole bunch of, in between that feels like it might be an awkward spot.
Yeah, that's true too. But let's just say those are givens. Let's just say the provider exists, consumers exist, consumer uploaded their Pact file to the broker, and now the provider is writing a verification test. So any potential problems on either side at this point?
Is the moment when the consumer kind of dictates when new contracts are put in the broker for the provider to validate, and sometimes that may mean like some new implementation because they need to develop new tests in order for that verification to happen. Is that a problem?
Yes, exactly. Yes, it is. That's a good point. So, and that's exactly so you could think of up to this point, that was phase one that we rolled it out. And, we're all about putting things out there. Let's see what happens. So that's exactly what we did as a company. And we definitely ran into those problems right away. So when a consumer publishes a new Pact file, which changes or breaks the existing contract on the broker, the provider build will fail, but the consumer can continue to production. So like I just talked about our build process, everything's automated now. So it didn't really take too much time for people to start implementing this, and then the provider builds fail. So if we take a look at this, what happens is the first consumer uploads their new Pact, and then they continue to production. And let's say the second consumer introduces the Pact with the break and change, and then they continue to production. And then the provider build fails when they run their verification test against both of these Pacts that are supposedly on the broker. Okay, so how do we solve this problem? What we told teams is you can introduce, Pact has a feature called tagging. So the consumer, now the first one, let's say they're the ones with the good Pact file. They introduce and put their Pact on the broker with the tag. Let's say the star is a tag. And then they continue to production. The second consumer, they are the ones with the breaking change. They introduce that Pact onto the broker as well, and then they continue to production. Now when the provider build runs, they don't fail. Their build does not break because they're only going to run against the Pact files with the tag. So teams like this idea. This got them through that issue, and they use tags. Could be the version number of the Pact, or it could be just more general. It could say just engineering, SAT, and prod, or engineering test and prod. So this allowed the consumers to upload Pact files whenever they got ready, and then they would just be sitting on the broker until the provider, they can select the provider, know, hey, I uploaded a new Pact file and it has the test tag on it. So you can go ahead and test in your test region when you get ready the new contract that we've uploaded. Any questions about that? Okay.
Is there a way that I can tag things as from here on or from here back? I'm thinking if a Pact file is specific to a tag, then the moment that I create a new tag is the moment that all of the old Pact files are no longer relevant.
No, that's not true. So remember, the broker keeps track of everything. So in the broker, you would see the previous file with that tag. So the provider could point to that previous file. It still exists.
So all tags are from here on?
Yes, because the broker has a concept of what is the latest file that you're uploading. But if the provider is not ready for that latest file, they can use a previous file with the previous tag.
That makes sense. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we talked about the first gap where the consumer can publish a new Pact file, continue to production, and the provider build fails. So we resolved that by using tagging. Now, the second gap that we ran into was if a provider changes their API spec in a way that breaks the consumer's contract when the consumer build So the provider will change their API spec in a way that breaks any consumer's contract. Then the consumer build will fail, but the provider can continue to production. So again, I told you our original goal is that the consumer should know when they're introducing a break and change, and the provider should know when they're introducing a break and change before they go to production. So now we're going to look at what happens on the provider side. So on the provider side, we introduce Swagger. So Swagger specs is a formal way of specifying what a REST API does. Swagger specification is written by the provider. Swagger specs include all the details of every REST endpoint that they own, and the provider can make changes to their API and publish new Swagger files for their consumers to use in the future. So Swagger is its own framework. And then we also joined it with an Atlassian tool, which does Pact Swagger validation. So it will validate the Swagger file and the Pact file during the build process. When a consumer creates a Pact that doesn't match the current Swagger file, the consumer's build will fail. And when the provider creates a Swagger file that does not, and the Swagger file that fails to conform to all of the consumer packs, then the provider's build will fail. So let's look at how this works. So the provider, they have their Swagger file and they send it over to the consumer. The consumer has their Pact file, and then they write a test that will verify that they both match. And once they both match, then they can continue to production. And the same on the provider side, the consumer will give the provider their Pact file, and they already have their Swagger file created. They will check that they match, and if they match, then they can go to production. Okay. So this solved our problems. So now let's look at what it looks like for the consumer's build process. The consumer writes the Pact Swagger verification test, executes the test, which will then go to our S3 bucket and get the Swagger spec. So our Swagger specs also live in the cloud and an S3 bucket. If they do not match, the test will fail, and then they should contact the provider. The provider can update the service to produce a new Swagger spec, or the consumer can change their expectations. If they do match, the test passes. During the build, the consumer's build, then it will upload the new Pact file to the broker. So you can see how this has changed our process, because up here, everything is done locally before you get to the consumer checking anything in. And at this point, you're still building your application. And this is where you're having those conversations with each other to make sure you're on the same page and you have clear expectations about what you're building before you even check anything in. All right, and then if we look at what happens on the provider side, the provider writes the Pact Swagger verification test, execute the test against the Pact broker. So during the run of the test, it can go to the broker and reference that Pact file that's on the broker. If they don't match, the test will fail. They should contact that consumer, and the consumer can either modify their expectations and create a new Pact file, or work with the provider to update their service. If they do match, the test is a success, and then at that point, the provider should check in. And when they check in, all the tests run again, and if everything is successful, then we publish that spec to the S3 bucket. Any questions about our build process? Okay. All right, so now we've looked back at our current gaps again. We saw the first one with tagging, with the consumer breaking changes and continuing to production. We introduced tags. On the provider side, if the provider makes any changes to their API, which breaks the consumer, their build will fail and the provider continues to production. We fixed that gap by using Swagger. And now some people still were asking some additional questions. Well, how do we know when a contract has changed? Well, that's a good question. The teams are getting advanced now. And then are there any final checks before deployment, right? Because you're still leaving it up to teams. Some teams may still feel like I'm independent, I want to do what I want, or they may just want it still an automatic process. Well, I shouldn't have to wait till a team tells me that the contract was uploaded, or before I'm ready to deploy now, I should just have another automatic check to let me know. So those are good questions. And Pact has additional features, which we talked about a little bit. So you can create an infrastructure that will trigger the provider verification when the consumer contract changes. So let's go back to when I mentioned the matrix. So the matrix keeps track of every Pact file that's uploaded, every version of the Pact, along with if there were any tags used. and whether or not they've been verified by the provider side. And then it uses a CLI tool called Can I Deploy, will use the information from that matrix to let you know during your deployment process if the Pact file that an application that you're about to upload with that version has been verified by the provider. So if it has been verified, what we did to put it into our build process, after the build finishes, it usually automatically kicks off a deployment, either engineering or SAT, however the teams have it configured. So we put the Can I Deploy right before that. So as soon as they merge to master, the build finishes successfully, it would automatically kick off the Can I Deploy. If Can I Deploy passes, it'll automatically go and continue and kick off your actual deployment. If it fails, then the team can go look at the logs, see that it failed, see why it failed, but it fails for a warning, just to let you know you're about to upload a version that has not been verified yet. Now the team can still decide to go ahead and kick off their deployment and continue into their engineering region if they like, or SAT region. But it just gives you the option, gives you the information. And then the webhooks are used for triggering a provider build when a Pact with new content is published from the consumer. So it can be either the consumer or the provider side, but you can configure some webhooks that will automatically kick off the builds. Any questions? Okay. All right, so to do a quick recap. We talked about the importance of contract testing in the microservice architecture. We talked about how to use Pact for consumer-driven contract testing, where we covered consumer-driven Pacts and provider Pact verification, and also showed how it works in the build process. We talked about any possible gaps with Pact and how to resolve them, and how to use Swagger specs for Pact Swagger validation on the consumer side and the provider side, along with the build explanation. And then we talked about any additional Pact features for extra deployment confidence and the do's and don'ts. I mentioned some do's and don'ts throughout the presentation, but let me just go over that again with some recommendations and best practices to sum up everything. So our recommendations after going through this process with many teams, this is what we've come up with. Like we mentioned earlier, communication is key. Teams should communicate changes and agree to a contract. And that is the main focus on this. It's not one-sided. You really do have to communicate and talk. And I would recommend that you do this earlier than later. And you can solve these problems any way that you see, as long as because I think we've also compared like other tools as well when we were looking at Pact. So the questions and the problems that we wanted to solve didn't change, even if we changed the tool. So keep that in mind too. So you can do the consumer-driven Pact. You can go fully Pact. That means that the consumer has to write the Pact, and you have to have a provider that writes the Pact verification. So it cannot be one-sided. The consumer can't say, okay, I'm going to do contract testing, and I don't know what my providers are doing. I'm going to just write this Pact file. And this is given that you know you have providers, you know you're going to be interacting with another team, you just don't know what their testing strategy is. So that's still not doing contract testing. It's good if both sides have that conversation and you agree on it. And the same with the provider side. The provider can't say, I think contract testing is great, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I don't know what my consumers are going to do, but I'm going to just write a mock-up Pact file, put it in my application, and write a test against my Pact. It doesn't work that way. Providers should not write Pacts because Pact is consumer driven. and providers should not do Pact verification if you do not have this conversation or this agreement with the consumer side. In that case, the provider should use Swagger. Get prepared and ready for their consumers, or have conversations with your consumers that this is what you're going to do. So another option is you can do Pact Swagger validation on the consumer side. So this means that the provider provides the Swagger file and the consumer writes the Pact Swagger validation test in place of that consumer contract test. Because what happens with this is the Pact, if you do Pact Swagger validation, the Pact will still get generated after that Pact Swagger validation test runs. So you don't need to do both. They both, if you did both tests, they would generate the same Pact file. So you just pick one option. And in this option, the provider does not write any additional tests. So then on the provider side, if they decide to do Pact Swagger validation, the provider uses their Swagger file to write the Pact Swagger validation test against all of their known consumers. And that's if they say, I know, because we've had these conversations at my company too, where providers reach out to us, hey, we're about to make this change and we want to be aware of all of our consumers. So we've had some provider teams that felt that way. And in that case, they could have their Swagger spec and validation run against all of their known consumer Pact files against what's on the broker. In this case, the consumer doesn't write any additional tests. Or the consumer and the provider can both do Pact Swagger validation. So you have a lot of options to choose from, depending on what works best for both sides. All right, so has everyone been paying attention and ready for this true-false recap? Are there any questions before we go through these true or false questions?
I would say.
Are there any downsides to this approach? Are there any places where you get into a race condition or a deadly embrace where both sides are waiting for the other one to begin?
I don't think so, because also in our build process, I didn't mention it, in most of the services, they automatically create Swagger specs. As you are building out your application, we have a tool in our POM file. If you run something, it'll automatically generate that spec. And so then when you check it into the build, it's automatically going to the S3 bucket. So in most cases, in that case, teams don't have to do anything.
We also have a question from Joel. Do you want to put it yourself?
Sure, I can go ahead and do it. So my question is, how does contract testing impact both the amount and scope of integration or end-to-end testing that you were doing before at Vanguard?
Yeah, that's a good question on where it falls. Some people get confused when they think it's integration. So in that time when we introduced Pact, integration testing was around functionality. It was testing from service to service. If you cared about that functionality, of course, and wasn't mocking it out, it was from service to service and it was functional. Where still API breaking changes were still being introduced, which is why we wanted to introduce contract testing, which I would say is more of an API testing than integration testing. So it has a different use case, or it's a different category of its own. Not to say like there isn't a way to set up your integration test to test APIs, depending on the tool. I've seen some new things try to happen, but at the time, this was the gap that we had, was with API testing, and our integration tests were not covering it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Any other questions?
So now we'll go for the questions. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sergi, if you want to take the lead. There you go.
Yes. So I think I'm going to put one question up at a time, or are you doing all of them at once?
No,
Yeah,
we are
good.
going to do one question at a time. We'll wait to
Okay.
20 seconds and then I will do the readout of the pool. Okay. So please, if you can answer it so we can close it.
All right, so the first question is contract testing is used to catch issues between microservices in production.
Okay, so 38% of the people said true, 72% of the people said false.
Okay, so the answer is false. So contract testing is used to catch issues between microservices before production. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right, but yep, it's to help you fix these issues before you get to production. Question number 2. Pact is a tool used for consumer-driven contract testing.
Okay, 94% of the people said true.
Great. The answer is true. Number 3, providers write the contract, which is the Pact file, and send them to consumers.
Okay, 74% of the people said false, 26 true.
Good. Yes, the answer is false because the consumer is the one that should write the contract, which is the Pact file, because it's consumer driven, and they should send them to the providers. Question 4. The contracts or Pact files are generated when a consumer Pact test passes.
47% of the people said true, 53 said false. So
Yeah,
false
so-
one's a little bit.
So I mentioned it a little bit. The answer is true. The consumer has to write a test. It's similar to a JUnit test. So if you think about it, they're going to write this JUnit test first. And then when it passes, then that's when this Pact file, that JSON, gets generated. Okay. So this question gets more into the implementation, which I didn't go deep into. Let's try this next one. Number 5. The Pact fragment or interaction is used to mock out the consumer REST call using request and response information.
Okay, here 81% of the people said true. 90% said false.
Oh, wait, you said 80? 80% said true?
81% said true.
Mm-hmm. And how many false?
19, 3 out of 16 people.
Okay, good. At first I thought you said something else. It's 90. So, okay, that's good. So this is true. Like, again, this gets into the implementation. But in that consumer test case, that JUnit, there is a section called a fragment or interaction, and that's what you use to mock out the consumer's REST call. Okay, so that's good. Good. 6, consumers should create multiple packs to the same provider with different provider names.
Okay, so here 79% of the people said false, 21 said true.
Okay, good. The answer is false. Kind of touched on it with that example with the consumer sending the get and the post in the same contract, right? And the provider is still the same. I've had consumers try to create Pact files with to the same provider with different names, and when it goes to the provider, they don't like that, and it doesn't make sense. One Pact per provider. Number 7.
Okay, I think we have 2 more questions, right, Allegra?
Yep, these are the last 2. So the Swagger file is a contract between microservices.
67% of the people said false, 33 said true.
Good, right? Because the Swagger file is the spec on the provider side. And the last one, providers with no consumers should create their own local contracts or Pact files and Pact verification tests.
And this was also very interesting. So true has 47%, false has 53%. So maybe not everybody knows this answer, right?
Yeah, so like I had mentioned, if you're a provider with no consumers, you should use Swagger specs, not Pact files. All right, and that's all I have. So thank you. Feel free to take my information and reach out if you have any other further questions.